Hello and a very warm welcome to Political Economy with Shweta Punj. Today, as we speak, there is devastating news coming in from the hill town of Wayanad in Kerala. Over 300 people have reportedly died because of incessant rains. Villages after villages have been wiped out. That's not it. In Himachal Pradesh, there has been a cloud burst and several people are reported to be missing. In Kedarnath in Uttarakhand, because of unprecedented rainfall, hundreds of pilgrims are stuck and are being rescued by the army. This comes after a brutal summer where India experienced exceptionally high temperatures. There has been a lot of talk about why and how India is facing the impact of climate change. All of this, high temperatures, unprecedented rainfall, all of this, and the way that ecologically sensitive areas have been developed, all of this is being blamed on climate change. But what is India really doing about countering the impact of climate change? What is the human and economic cost of climate change? And where are we in the journey to ensure that our future generations do not face what the current generation is facing? Is it going to get worse from here on, or can it get better? To understand this debate more, to understand this very nuanced subject more, I have with me one of India's exceptional thought leaders in the space of climate change, Mr. Jayant Sinha. He has been a policy maker. He was Minister of State for Finance and Civil Aviation, and currently he is the pioneer of India's fight against climate change. Mr. Sinha, thank you so much for joining us. You're joining us from all the way in Boston. And I started the show by putting out some very distressing news, and I'm sure you are also seeing it there. What is really going on here, Mr. Sinha? Why is it that in Wayanad there was a red alert warning that was given, which was missed by the state, and that is not the only reason why we are seeing the kind of devastation that we have seen. Um, just help us understand that how does the impact of climate change play out in a country like India?
So, greetings from Boston, Shweta. Thank you very much for having me on your show. And thank you also very much for discussing this vitally important topic, which for all of us as Indians is not something abstract or something that we have to worry about 10 or 20 years from now. It's what's
Absolutely.
happening to the planet, and it's happening now, and it's impacting our lives every single day. The best way to think about it, Shweta, is to recognize that the world is on fire. The world
Mm,
is on fire. And
mm,
whether it is in Vayanad, whether it is in Delhi, whether it is in my own Jharkhand, or whether it is around the world in the United States, in Australia, in
mm,
Europe, everywhere the world is on fire and people are dealing with the disastrous impact of climate change every single day. You've just told us about the heat waves that we experienced in Delhi, the cloudburst that just happened 2 days ago, the
yeah.
terrible, terrible landslides that are happening in
Mm,
ecologically very delicate areas, such as, in fact, in Kerala, on the Western
mm,
Ghats, in Himachal, and in Uttarakhand, again, on the very fragile ecology of the Himalayas. So, as rainfall is increasing, we are getting these
mm,
landslides because of human development, because of the fragile sort of ecology that exists in any case. And now, suddenly, because of climate change, these massive rainfall events that are happening where we are seeing rain. At levels that we've never really seen before. So the combination of
mm,
all of these things is actually ending up in a situation where all of our lives are impacted. This is not something we can wish away. This is not something that we can ignore. It's a factor in everybody's day-to-day life. When you're stuck between Gurgaon and Delhi for 3 hours in a traffic jam, a lot of it is in fact because of climate change. When you can't leave the house because it's so hot and muggy outside, it is because
mm,
of climate change. When
mm,
agricultural yields drop and food inflation goes up, और सब जाते हैं बाजार में कहते हैं कि सब्जी का भाव क्यों बढ़ गया, टमाटर
mm,
इतने पैसे का क्यों है,
mm,
प्याज इतने पैसे का क्यों है. This is happening because we are getting these very volatile climate patterns. It's raising food prices and it's creating landslides and floods and heat waves and everything else. So we really
Right.
have to tackle it, and we have to tackle it immediately.
And Mr. Sinha, this is an outcome of decades and decades of exploitation of our ecology and of not taking corrective action.
Exactly right. And of course, most of the responsibility lies with the developed nations, because they are
Hmm.
the ones that have been pumping carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And
Hmm.
what used to be 150 to 200 parts per million of carbon
Hmm.
dioxide in the atmosphere, we have now crossed over to about 420, 430 parts per million. So we've
Hmm.
reached levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that have not been seen before for millions of years. So
Hmm.
suddenly, obviously, we are going to get into a zone of climate changes that the planet has not experienced before. And certainly,
Hmm.
as human civilization, which really only has happened on this planet for the last 10,000 years, we've been in a very temperate sort of climate zone. Now, suddenly, we're moving out of that temperate climate zone and into a much more extreme climate zone, with carbon
Right.
parts per million having gone literally through the roof. So,
Hmm.
how all of this is going to play out in our own lifetimes is a big question mark. We
Hmm.
understand some of the changes that are happening, but there are
Hmm.
many tipping points. There are many extreme changes also that can happen. And at a
Hmm.
minimum, we need to take insurance against these very extreme events. But any sensible policymaker at this stage would take the
Hmm.
necessary solid steps, both on what's called mitigation, that is reducing carbon emissions in India and around the world, and at the
Right.
same time for adaptation, because the planet is going to get warmer quicker.
Hmm. I want to ask you, Mr. Sinha. Now, when it comes to let's talk about India. One, is there a calculation on the cost of climate change, whether it's economic, whether it's the human cost of climate change, and secondly, in terms of policy interventions, we've seen a lot of focus on renewable energy, solar, for instance. This budget, Ms. Raman spoke about building climate resilience and diversifying agriculture into climate resilient crops and so on. We have seen a lot of banter about this, but when it comes to fundamental change on ground, I feel like there has been a bit of a disconnect. So let's begin with one. Let me urge you to answer the first part of my question on, why should India sit up, and why should all of us sit up and take notice? What is the economic cost of climate change, and what is the human cost? Is there a calculation? Is there a assessment out there that we can refer to?
Yeah, so Shweta, let's look at it first in terms of principles and then in terms of policies. But
Hmm.
first, let's look at it in terms of principles. Number one principle that we have to remember is that net zero is net
Hmm.
positive. Net
Hmm.
zero is net positive. So let me repeat
Hmm.
that again, just so that everybody can sort
And
of
if you could just
think
break it
about
down
this.
for our viewers, what is net zero? What is net
Yeah,
zero?
so
Just
I'll
break it
I'll
down.
explain that. So net zero
Sure.
is net positive, and the idea of net zero is to
Hmm.
bring to net zero our emissions of greenhouse gases. So
Hmm.
today India is emitting about 3.5 billion tons of carbon equivalent greenhouse gases. 3.5 billion tons is what India is emitting, and what we
Hmm.
want to be able to do, and the Honorable Prime Minister has already announced, is that we are going to take this 3.5 billion tons and reduce it down to zero, and that's
Hmm.
called net zero, getting our emissions down to zero. Now, on our current trajectory, on current policies, actually by 2050, we are not headed towards zero. In fact, we're headed towards somewhere between 10 to 12 billion tons of emissions. So currently, even though the world requires us to get to zero, we are actually going from 3.5 billion tons to 10 to
Hmm.
12 billion tons, which means that
Hmm.
all of the problems that we are dealing with right now are going to get worse. And one way to think about it, you're in Delhi, Shweta, I live in Delhi also. One way to think about it is that the max temperatures in Delhi right now are in the late 40s, 47, 48, 49. These are the max temperatures. In the
Right.
next 20 to 30 years, the max temperatures in Delhi are headed towards the mid 50s. It's going to be in the mid 50s. So
Yes.
the cost of not going to net zero is extremely high. It's going to have
Hmm.
economic impacts, it's going to have health impacts, it's going to have social impacts. These are very, very high costs. Some people believe that it's going to affect GDP by 10 or 20%, that India's GDP will be reduced by 20, 30% over the long term if we don't get to
Hmm.
net zero. So the cost
Mm.
of not getting to net zero is very, very high. And that's what's called the damage function. The economists call that the damage function. And
Mm.
as I said, that cost 10 to 20% initially, but eventually 20 to 30% of GDP will be gone because
Mm.
we are not getting to net zero. So getting to
Got
net zero is net
it. Mm.
positive, and it's net
Mm.
positive in terms of GDP, as I said. It's net positive in terms of job creation. It's net positive in terms of air pollution, and it's net positive in terms of our own energy security. So any
Mm.
way you look at it,
Mm.
net zero is net positive. So that's principle number one. We've got
Right.
to decarbonize. We've got to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and not just because we're doing it for Europe or the United States. We're doing it for our own selves. It's in our own
Mm.
self-interest to get to net zero. Number one.
Mm.
Number
Mm.
two. Number two. That net zero is something that is the driver for our growth going forward. If in fact we do invest in net zero, and most of our infrastructure is still to be built, so if we do invest in net zero, we are going to drive our growth as well. And so it's
Mm.
very, very important for us as we build out our infrastructure. And the honorable finance minister has announced 11 lakh crores in infrastructure investment in this year. We are building up our infrastructure. That infrastructure has to be ready to cope with climate change. And the
Mm.
third principle, so number one principle, net zero is net positive. Number two principle, let's build our infrastructure so that we can deal with climate change. And number three principle is that it's going to cost us trillions of dollars extra to do it. But that's good, that's positive, because
Mm.
right now our investment rate is not what it needs to be to get to 8 to 10% GDP growth and create crores of jobs. So if we
Right.
increase our investment rate and we do it in green investments, which is what we need, we can massively increase our growth rate, massively increase jobs. But it's all about the money. It's about trillions and trillions of dollars, lakhs and lakhs of crores that need to
Mm.
be invested every year behind
To build a.
adaptation and mitigation. Yeah.
No. So let me go back to your first argument that net zero is equal to net positive. Now, for a developing country like India, we are building our roads. We are talking about ramping up our manufacturing. We have millions of MSMEs that are really in the cost game because they're trying to compete with the world, and considering they're battling so much red tape, they probably cut back on a lot of these kind of technologies where they probably go for something that's cheaper than what's environmentally sound. So that's only one aspect of it. So how does a country like India that
But
is
Shweta, let
still.
me let me
Yeah.
let me correct you on that. So there is a fallacy, there is a
Mm.
wrong view that
Mm.
green technologies are more expensive. That's wrong.
Okay.
Today, in many industries, green
Mm.
is cheaper than brown. And that's
Mm.
exactly what we need to invest behind. That's
Mm.
exactly what we need to focus on. So
Mm.
please do not, sort of encourage this thinking or
Sure.
promote this perspective that green is expensive. Green is cheap. Green is affordable. Today,
Mm.
virtually all our auto rickshaws are switching away from petrol to electric because it's much cheaper.
Elections.
The cost per kilometer of a petrol auto rickshaw is 5 rupees.
Mm.
The
Mm.
cost per kilometer of a electric auto rickshaw is 50 paisa. Okay,
Mm.
so
Mm.
it's much, much cheaper. It's one tenth the price of a
Correct.
petrol auto rickshaw. And whether you buy
Mm.
an electric auto rickshaw or a petrol auto rickshaw, the cost is about the same, about 1.5 lakh rupees. So one and a
Mm.
half, 2 lakh rupees, depending on what features you get. You can either
Mm.
buy a petrol auto rickshaw and run it for 5 rupees a kilometer, or you
Mm.
can buy an electric auto rickshaw and run it at 50 paisa a liter, 50
So
paisa kilometer.
when it comes to building infrastructure, now that's been one of our core focus areas, building infrastructure, and somewhere, how do we approach it? Because we are building roads, we are building highways at the moment. How do we do it in a sustainable manner that it protects our ecology, and in terms of our carbon emissions, it does not pollute our environment as much.
So there are three parts to that answer, Shweta. Number one is let market forces work, right? So
Hmm.
I gave you the example of electric auto rickshaws. It's market forces. The fact that the
Yes.
unit economics of auto rickshaws that are electric are far superior to those of petrol they are
mm,
resulting in very fast adoption of electric auto rickshaws. That's how market forces work. The same thing
right.
is true in e-buses. The same thing is true now increasingly with round-the-clock solar. So in all these cases, market forces are working, green technologies are being adopted, and we are
Mm,
decarbonizing the economy. So that's number
mm,
one. Okay.
mm,
Number two, the government has a job to do to send the right price signals. Now, to an
mm,
extent, we are doing that because there are high fuel taxes in India. Of course, petrol and diesel is heavily taxed
mm,
as aviation fuels. So we are sending the right price signals and saying that fossil fuels are expensive. Government is, of
mm,
course, providing a lot of support through production linked incentives as well to build solar panels and batteries. So there
mm,
again, we are providing the right price signals. So this is exactly what government should do and is doing. And then number
mm,
three, and this is where we need to do much more in India, is we need to invest in a lot more R&D associated with green technologies that will eventually
mm,
reduce the cost of green technologies more and more. Solar has
mm.
come down in cost because of the R&D that's happened, right?
Right,
Batteries have
right.
come down in cost because of the R&D that's happened. Now, the good
Got it.
news is that the developed world is investing massively behind these technologies, and they are becoming more and more cost effective. The Honorable Finance Minister in her budget just now announced a major push beyond small modular nuclear reactors. Small modular nuclear reactors, they're called SMR
Mm,
reactors, small
yeah.
modular reactors. Now, where do these small modular reactors come from? They come from
Mm,
the tremendous amount of R&D that's been done around making nuclear more cost effective, safer,
mm,
more affordable. So nuclear fission has benefited from this R&D that's been done in the US and in Japan. And so we now
mm,
want to go and get these SMRs as well for India.
mm,
So we are
mm,
benefiting from the R&D that's being done around the world. We need to
mm,
do some R&D as well, for example, in pumped hydro, in grid level battery storage, etc., so that we can get these green technologies to get to be cheaper and cheaper. But
mm,
effectively, for the next 10 years, we in India can
mm,
invest hundreds of billions of dollars, lakhs of
mm,
crores, without worrying about cost effectiveness. Green technologies
mm,
are way, way more cost effective in all of
mm.
these instances, and market forces will work there.
Okay. Mr. Sinha, if you were to recommend some policy interventions that need to be made immediately for for us to move forward in this journey at a more aggressive pace, what would they be?
So I have written about this in one of my articles that just came out in Mint. I think we need three structural reforms. Number
Hmm.
one, we need to be able to put in place national climate legislation, and I had moved a private member bill setting up a national climate change commission that would then create carbon budgets for each state and for various industries, and that would help us go down this decarbonization trajectory. So that's one very important thing. National climate legislation. Many countries have already got it. The UK has it, New Zealand has it, European Union has it, and so on. So national climate legislation is the number one structural reform. And let's not kid ourselves. This is going to be something that is going to be as immense and as important for our economy as GST was. So I was deeply involved in the GST policy making and the GST legislation and so on. But that's the scale of the reform that's required to be able to do national climate change. So that's the
Hmm.
number one structural reform. The number two structural reform, and I'm very pleased in the budget that this has been taken forward, is an Indian carbon market so that we can
Hmm.
trade carbon credits and create a discovered price for carbon. So carbon markets is the number two policy recommendation. And the number three policy recommendation is to actually set up a green investment agency that can lower the cost of capital for green technologies. Now, the budget took a step forward in this regard by suggesting that we will create a green taxonomy, and that green taxonomy will separate out green investments from non-green investments. And that's very important because then we can direct capital to the green investments. So we did take a step forward in the budget in that regard as well.
Okay, now that you've mentioned the budget, and I cannot not ask you about the budget, it's drawn very sharp reactions from all across, whether it is the middle class or it's the investor community. The business community really does not come out and say much at all. So, so I want to ask you, Mr. Sinha, according to you, what does this budget really do? Is it a growth-oriented budget? Is it a consumption-oriented budget? What is it?
Well, it's very hard to really stick a label onto a budget because a
Hmm.
budget always has to balance many different interests and it has to take into account many different policy requirements, which this budget has, I think, masterfully done. It's very important to really push employment and skilling, which, of course, this budget has done very, very clearly. There's lakhs of crores that are allocated for various different employment programs, the internship program, the skilling program, and that I think will be a great booster for employment. And I think that is a very, very important, if not the number one priority in the budget. The number
But do
two
you,
priority in the budget has been
yes.
macroeconomic stability, which of course, with the 4.9% fiscal deficit number, that has been maintained. And number three, of course, is the continued push for infrastructure, which is what the 11 lakh crores plus the 1.5 lakh crores for states ensures.
Okay. How about increasing of LTCG and STCG and removal of indexation benefits for the real estate sector? Uh, do you think the time was right for us to do something like this? Because it's only now that the retail investors were coming in, mutual funds, were giving very handsome returns to the retail investors, and now suddenly they are left high and dry.
I wouldn't
Was
say
now
they're
the
left high
time?
and dry. It was important. It was important to unify capital gains across the different asset classes, which is what the budget has attempted to do. Left to myself, I probably would have suggested that taxpayers would have the ability to either pick the indexation methodology with the 20% capital gains tax, or
Hmm.
switch to the new regime with 12.5%. So I would have given people the
Hmm.
choice, like we've done in the past on direct
Hmm.
taxes, to choose one regime or the other. And that way
That's right.
we could have had a 2 or 3 year window of transition so
Hmm.
that people could deal with the new tax structure. So I might have done it that way.
Hmm.
Ultimately, of course, you do want to make sure that all asset classes, financial and non-financial assets, are on a level playing field so that you're not
Hmm.
tilting it in one way or the other. And I
Hmm.
think that's what the budget has sought to do.
So, as one of the architects of GST that we see today, I have to ask you. There has been so much talk about tax terrorism that's come forward. Recently, there was a tax notice that was sent to Infosys for running into thousands of crores. We've seen gaming companies, face tax notices, which are maybe 100 times more than their annual revenues. Is this how you had envisaged GST, Mr. Sinha?
So Mr. Jaitley, Shweta, spoke very eloquently against tax terrorism. And all the efforts that we have undertaken over the last decade or so have really been to take discretion away from tax authorities and take away this kind of excessive demands away from tax authorities. And that is an ongoing effort. Obviously, the faceless assessments are a way of taking discretion away. So that really is the objective that we are all pursuing.
Hmm.
Having worked extensively with tax authorities, both in my role as MOS Finance and then as chair of the Finance Committee for 5 years,
Hmm.
I find that the system is definitely getting better over time. And at the same time, we have streamlined and simplified processes and procedures and regulations considerably over the years. And still, despite our best efforts, we find that there are various actors in the system, almost one would say people who are not well intentioned, who
Hmm.
sometimes end up with these very, very aggressive tax demands. And that's unnecessary. Really, our objective has always been to
Hmm.
simplify, streamline, and make it much more tax, payer friendly over time. So that is absolutely the goal. But again,
Hmm.
there will always be some situations and some instances which will turn out to be quite problematic.
Right. So, in the last 2 to 3 years, Mr. Sinha, what's happened is that GST is less known for its simplicity, but more for its aggressive tax demands and a very aggressive tax administration. And it's dampened the investment sentiment quite a bit. Like businesses are worried; they're all caught up in litigation. So it hurts entrepreneurship. It hurts. It hurts everybody. It helps no one. But while we've seen policymakers talk about the need for a simpler tax regime, but action on the ground, I think, could have been far more aggressive to tackle this.
Those are very legitimate issues, Shweta, that you're pointing out. And of course, as the Honorable Prime Minister and the Honorable Finance Minister have said on multiple occasions, the goal is ease of doing business. The goal
Hmm.
is a tax structure that's simple and very taxpayer friendly. And of course, as you know, the GST Council, led by the Finance Minister of Bihar, is in fact engaged in an exercise where they're going to try and simplify and streamline the GST tax code as much as possible, so
Hmm.
that it becomes even better and easier for taxpayers. But
Hmm.
as I said earlier, those are legitimate issues, legitimate problems, and our goal, of course, continuously has been to make things easier for taxpayers.
Hmm. Is there a case, Mr. Sinha, to lower the tax case specifically for life insurance, health insurance, and so on? A demand that's been made by Mr. Gadkari to the GST Council. Is it time now to rationalize the rates further? And when I say
My
rationalize, I
position,
mean reduce.
yeah.
Yeah.
Our position, and when I say our, I mean the Standing Committee on Finance of the 17th Lok Sabha. Of course, now we are in the 18th Lok Sabha, so I can't speak for the next Finance Committee. But I chaired the Finance Committee in the 17th Lok Sabha for 5 years, and when we issued our report on insurance. With absolute consensus, everybody, and we had very distinguished members of our finance committee in the 17th Lok Sabha, everybody agreed that we should, reduce the GST on life insurance and health insurance because these are necessities for modern living, and we should definitely eliminate these GST. Rates for life insurance and health insurance. That's for the benefit of the people. I'm not sure that the revenue aspect of it is very large. I think the revenue aspect of it is quite modest. But in return for that, we will see much more security for people because they'll be protected with respect to life and health. And at the same time, it will be a great boost to the insurance industry if we can massively grow the market for life and health. And remember in this, Shweta, that when people think about insurance, they think of it very much from the point of view of their own individual situation where they say, okay, now I can afford health insurance. But by paying premiums, we also provide capital to the insurance companies, which is then invested in the economy and can enable us to build long term infrastructure and invest in new companies and everything else. And to that extent, life insurance is particularly important because you might
Hmm.
pay premiums for 20, 30, 40 years before actually there is a life insurance policy that's paid out. So insurance companies then have that money for 30, 40 years to invest in our economy.
Hmm.
And that long term money coming into the insurance sector is very powerful from an investment point of view. So don't just think of it in terms of the individual who's getting life insurance. Think of it in terms of the investment that's being made in the economy as well. And that is the multiplier effect that you get from insurance. So given the
Right.
multiplier effect of insurance, given the fact that our coverage ratios in insurance are quite low, if we can reduce the cost and improve coverage, we can have a huge multiplier effect on the economy. And which is why we as a committee had strongly endorsed the idea that we should eliminate GST on life and health insurance.
And what was the response? Were you able to present it to the concerned decision makers?
No, no, obviously, all reports that are done by parliamentary committees go to the ministry and go to
Mhm.
the Honorable Finance Minister. But they are
Mhm.
the executive, we are just the legislators. So
Sure.
it's for the executive to make those decisions,
Sure.
particularly around GST, which is made by the GST Council, by the center and the states collectively.
Mhm. Right.
As legislators, we can provide inputs and recommendations.
Sure. All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Sinha, for putting a whole host of issues into perspective for us. Thank you very much. And we do hope that you enjoy your time in Boston and that you're back in Delhi very soon. A big thank you to all our viewers for tuning in. We do hope that today's conversation has helped you understand the impact of climate change on us, on our everyday life, and more importantly, on what we as a country really need to do to take our journey in sustainability forward. And of course, as always, Mr. Sinha has cleared a lot of fog around policy making and thinking of policy makers on a whole host of issues, including the contentious issue of high GST on medical insurance and life insurance. A big thank you for tuning in, and thanks so much for watching. Thank you, Mr. Sinha. We'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shweta. Thank you.